Okay, I really hope that works. So, all right. So we'll go ahead and get started tonight. And thank you all again for joining. My name is Linda Resch, and I'm the artist in residence here at the Art Center. So I've been doing a few classes online this way since the quarantine happened. And thank you for jumping in. And if you have any questions as we're going, you can go ahead and shout out to me, or you can type something over in the chat too. So I'm going to move these examples out of the way. Tonight we're going to be doing watercolor landscapes, focusing on creating big skies. So it has kind of a dramatic appeal to it. The way that I like to start these landscapes is by just thinking about kind of what my ground lines should look like. And I usually start, actually, let me just get a clean paper here. I'm going to try drawing in pencil, but if you can't see it, let me know and I'll switch over to Sharpie. So I usually start by, can't really see that.
Yeah, it's not coming through, Linda.
Okay, let me try one thing really fast, but it tends to be really bright and blown out no matter what. Yeah, that didn't help. Okay, well, I'm just going to draw mine with Sharpie, but if you would, I think you guys should start with pencil first and then outline lines that you want to keep in your Sharpie. In case you make mistakes, you can erase the pencil. And draw pretty lightly to start with too. So I usually just start by making some simple hill lines across the bottom of my page. And something that you might hear artists talk about is a thing called rule of thirds, where you want to try to divide your paper up kind of into thirds. So 1/3 of it would be the land, and then 2/3 would be sky. Sometimes you'll see it the other way around, where we have 2/3 of the paper land all the way up this high, and then just a little bit of sky showing. But by doing this, it helps to make your composition look just a little bit more interesting, a little bit more balanced. If we have half ground and half sky, it's just not quite as pleasing to the eye. So today we're going to work with the bottom third of our paper as land and the top third as sky. And you can give or take a little bit. For this example, it looks like my bottom is maybe just a bottom fourth of the paper, but I really like the look of this, so I'm not going to add any more hills. If I wanted to, I could continue making just a few more hill lines going up into the sky. This one I have just a little bit more happening, but I really like how this looks. And you don't have to divide your hills in half like I did here. If you would rather do, better not do that. Something where it's more like just basic lines going across your page and not divided in half. This works just fine as well. We just want to get a little bit of depth and distance by creating more than one ground line. So go ahead and do that. And then another thing that I like to do in my picture, I usually like to put some kind of tree life happening in the scene. So in this example, I had put a tree grove, not as far away as it could be on my last hill, but in just a little bit closer to me. And then another smaller tree grove kind of on the skyline on my last hill. So you want to be thinking about your distance and your perspective. You know that if you're standing close to something, it's going to look a lot bigger than if it's far away. So if you decide to put a tree or some kind of subject matter down here on the bottom, this is going to be as close to you as we could be. So it will probably be a lot taller going up into the sky. For this project tonight, I'm not going to do anything like that because I don't really want anything in the foreground obstructing the view of the sky. I want this sky to be my focal point and that to be the thing that really draws my interest in the picture. So any little subject matter like trees or whatever you might think that you want to put, it's going to be small and just a minor detail, just something to add just a little bit of interest in the land, but we really want our focus to be on the sky. So if you want to add a few little trees, go ahead and do that. At this point, if you like the look of the outlined Sharpie, you can go ahead and outline your land and your trees. If you would rather just keep everything watercolor painted today, you wouldn't have to do this part. One other thing, I don't remember if I said this yet or not, but usually when I'm adding trees, I like to keep an odd number of trees. I did do 4 over here, but total it becomes 7. So odd numbers usually look a little bit more pleasing to the eye too than if we have even numbers. So I think I'll just do one larger one over here and be done.
And you do this before you lay down paint? You can't do it after?
Well, you can do it after. I like to do it before because it just gives me a really solid idea of where my ground is and where my subject is. With the Sharpie, you can paint right over it and it's going to look exactly the same. Okay. Watercolor paint is not going to affect Sharpie. If you have a different kind of marker and you're not sure if it's a permanent marker or not, then you probably don't want to do this right now because any type of water-based marker is going to bleed into your sky a little bit, which sometimes can look really cool, but it's probably not the effect that we want tonight. But you could do Sharpie again after it dried too. So this one is pretty well dry. If I wanted to, like, I don't know if you can see it or not. Let me hold it up. But my trees did get covered just a little bit because I tried using the metallic paint. And so some of that metallic glitter did cover my Sharpie. So if I wanted to, I could go back right over the top of this and redefine some of those trees. So if you do that, make sure that you wait till your paper is totally dry, because if it's still wet, the Sharpie is going to get ruined. So I'll just go ahead and show you the basic process for wet into wet to start with. And probably at this point, if you want to just watch what I'm doing, it might be easier than trying to paint at the same time. And then I'll give you guys a chance to do yours and you can ask questions as you're working. So I had done 3 different examples before we started tonight. This one was the first one I did, and I made it more like a day scene. So I left a lot of white in the sky to kind of reflect as clouds or just to show that it's a brighter time of day. This one would be more of a sunset look. And this one is actually still a little bit wet because I got really carried away with the wet into wet. Let me pull it up closer. Not sure if you can really see it or not. Let me see here, just one second. I can refocus my camera. There we go. These little speckles that you see up in the sky, this texture that you see, that was created by sprinkling table salt into the paint when it was still wet. That can be a really cool effect if you're trying to make snow. Sometimes it works well for making like beach sand or dirt. So that would be something, let's see, stop being blurry. That would be something that you might want to consider trying too in some of your skies. You need to do that when the paper is super duper wet though. So a lot of what I'm showing you tonight, you'll have to work kind of fast when you're working. And then this one was just a really darker night sky. So with this one, I didn't leave very much white showing through at all. And I actually used black in this picture, which I don't do very often. Sometimes with certain watercolor trays, if you try to use black, it just takes over everything. Like all of your other colors will be a really nice light and pastel, and then you put black down and it just is super dark and kind of takes over the world. So that's just your warning about black, but go ahead and try it if you want to. Just know that that may happen. So here's what I do to do the wet into wet technique. I'm gonna start with that bigger flat brush. If you have a bigger brush than this in your basket and you want to use that, go for it. But this is the one that came with our packet. And you want to have clean water. So actually, before I even do this step, what I usually do, can you see my paint trays? There they are. I usually take my brush and just drip some drips of water into my paint trays. And I'm not touching my paint yet. I'm just dripping from above. I used these paints earlier, so they're wet already, but if you have dry paints, this is just going to get your paints ready to use. This little puddle will soak into your paints while you're working on everything else, and then when you're ready to add paint, those colors will already be ready. So if you want to go ahead and do that while I'm working on the wet into wet demonstration, if you want to just start adding your drips to your paints, go for it. And then those can sit for a little bit. Even though we do that to our paints, we always need to dip our brush in water before we touch the paint. So we will have very wet paints today and a very wet paper. So,
Hey, Linda,
yeah.
question quick. What kind of salt did you use?
I just used the regular, this stuff, table salt.
Like, okay, so not salt.
Well, when I was taught this in college, I was told that like margarita salt works better. And I think it probably does create like a bigger flake texture, but when I used the table salt tonight, that was all I had and it seemed to work just fine. You'll notice that it works really well in blue and purple. Like those colors, the effect is very strong, but in some of the other colors like red, you don't tend to see it working as well. So it must just be kind of something that deals with the paint pigment too, but it worked really well when I did it in the black. I'm going to take my brush, and my water is still clean now because I haven't touched paint yet. And now I need to start working really fast. So I'm going to get my brush super wet and just watch how often I dip my brush in water as I'm doing this. I'm going to saturate my sky and just constantly going back and getting more water. It's okay if puddles form on your paper. You want to get every inch of the sky really super wet. And your paper probably is going to start to curl a little bit. That's just what happens when we use really wet techniques on like lower grade watercolor paper. If you find that you really like this technique and you want to do it a whole bunch more, I would suggest investing in something called a watercolor block, which is a tablet of watercolor paper. Usually has about 15 sheets. It's a little more expensive, but the sheets come glued down on the side, so it's like you're working on a block of wood. And then when you're done with your painting, you use like a flat credit card or a knife or something to peel this paper off of the block. And that will tend to keep your paper from curling and warping as it gets wet and dry. But notice how I'm just covering everything. You can kind of see the difference between this dry sheet of paper and the wet sheet. There's a nice shine on the wet sheet. Sometimes it's hard to see it, so if you get down at eye level and just look at your paper and make sure that there's wetness everywhere in that sky, the water's gonna dry pretty quickly, so we need to just keep adding water and then we'll start adding paint. I have not done my ground yet. I'm going to save that and do that later. So I want sky to be one section, ground to be a second section. So sky is still really wet. Now here's where we start to have fun. I'm just going to start grabbing my colors. Again, I'll dip my brush in water every time before I touch paint and just start adding these colors into the sky. If you want to do a more daylight scene, you're going to want to leave some things like this where the white paper shows through. If you're looking to do a night scene, you're going to need to get a little bit heavier with your color and maybe kind of overlap like what I'm doing now where I'm forcing my colors to mix together. But the colors will mix together on their own, so you don't have to do too much brushing at this point. The trick is to make sure you're working pretty fast, because once the paper starts to dry, wet into wet won't work anymore. If you notice your paper starting to dry, just get some clean water right away and brush more water on your paper before adding more paint. I'm going to use some of these metallic paints too, because I really kind of liked the effect that I got with those earlier. They were not overly metallic where that there was just like all shiny glitter, but I did kind of like a little bit here and there in my sky.
Guess we should be doing this.
Another thing you can try is getting your brush wet with paint and then dropping drops. So just kind of holding your brush above and shaking it. When you start to notice that you're in an area of paper that has a lot of paint already, you probably want to just move on to another area and let the paint that you already have settle. If I would keep brushing and keep brushing and keep brushing, eventually I'm going to lose all of these beautiful patterns that happen naturally, and it would all just run together and become like a brownish color. So the trick with wet into wet is kind of knowing when to stop and when to just let everything settle. Okay, so I'm going to get my top done here, and then I'll show you just a couple special effect techniques that you may or may not choose to do. And you don't have to use every color. If you want to keep your sky limited to maybe 2 or 3 color choices, depending on the time of day that you're trying to convey, that's totally fine. When I do this with the kids in school, they usually pick every single color and it winds up looking a little too much. So now when my sky is still wet, that's when I can take a paper towel if I wanted to, and I could just dab away sections of the paper. This works for creating clouds if you didn't leave any white space showing. This also works to, if you make a mistake and you really don't like a color in one area, if you work fast enough, this works pretty well to remove paper or to remove paint from paper. But once the paint has started to dry even a little bit, it's not going to work anymore. Another thing that might happen is you might notice a really big puddle somewhere down on your page. So if you don't like that puddle, you can use this method to dab up that puddle. And if there's a big enough puddle around, the paint should just resettle in that area like mine did. And then I'll show you the salt right away too, since we have a wet painting here. Salt, I'm really hoping this shows up on the document camera. Just take a little bit of salt and just sprinkle it all over. I'm gonna lift mine up, maybe you can see effects. You're probably gonna wanna leave your paper flat until it's mostly dry before you move it out of the way so your paints don't run. But you can see my salt is starting to absorb paint. And as this dries, the salt will suck in the paint pigment and it will leave like that white texture pattern that we saw around it. You don't want to leave your salt on your paper forever. So once you have your painting that is dried, let's see, where's my salt one? This is the one from earlier. Then I would just want to brush that salt off of the paper. If you leave it on there forever, it actually makes the paint color kind of disintegrate completely and it would turn the entire area white. So that's what it looks like,
really
when it is complete. So I think I'm gonna just let you guys work for a little bit at this point and you can ask questions. And then I'll probably do a second one so I can show you just a couple other techniques. Does that sound good?
Sure.
Good.
Okay. So feel free to jump in and ask questions, or if you want to show me your picture, especially if you're working with an iPhone or an iPad, or phone or an iPad, you can turn your screen so that I can see what you're working on. As your sky starts to dry, you'll really notice like lines and edges forming around your paint, kind of almost like a stain would form an edge. So if you don't like how that is looking, you can dip your brush in just water and you can kind of work with that edge and move it around and try to soften it. This doesn't always work the way that you want it to. So if the edge isn't bothering you very much, I would recommend just leaving it and letting it be part of the sky. That's one nice thing about watercolor, and one thing that watercolor is kind of known for is are these interesting edges and puddles and shapes that form that we really have no control over. Watercolor can be a tricky medium in that way. My water looks pretty dirty right now from all of those colors that I mixed. So I'm gonna take a second and go change my water out. I will be right back. If you start to notice your water looking dirty, you probably are gonna wanna do the same thing.
So wet.
Hmm?
It's so wet.
It's supposed to be.
How's it going?
It's so wet.
Good, it should be so wet.
Mine was dry.
A lot of water.
You'll still need to work pretty quickly though, because one thing about water is that it dries. And when I do this with kids in school, probably the hardest part for them is to dip their brush in water constantly and add enough water, they tend to want to just paint out the same water that they have on their paper, and then that just makes it dry faster. I still haven't done anything to my ground. I'm probably typically what I would do would be to wait until my sky has dried, because right now if I would paint this ground and touch wet paint into my sky, whatever color I use for ground is going to go up into the sky too. And in this case, I don't want that to happen. Sometimes it might be fine.
Yours looks a lot better than mine.
Did you already say how we're supposed to get the salt off the paper?
Wait till it dries and then you just brush it off.
Just brush it off, okay.
Yep, but wait till it dries.
Will do.
Yeah, so probably like an hour or two from now. I would say 2 hours, you're definitely safe. Sometimes it can be done within an hour. How's Arnie and Rachel doing?
Can you get me clean water too?
I'm doing fine. I'm not getting the effect I intended, but that's part of the process.
I'm doing good.
Okay.
I found out my paper towel has a pattern to it, and that imprinted on the paint, so I had to switch to Kleenex.
Wow, I've never run into that before with the paper towel thing. Kleenex will probably work, but since it's a softer material, sometimes you might run into problems where it sticks to your paper and actually kind of tears and leaves a thin cloth residue from the tissue. So actually toilet paper, depending on the brand.
My sky.
Paper towel is usually the best, but yeah, you don't want an imprint.
Can't use toilet paper for something like that these days.
Valuable. Use a dollar bill. Actually, like a washcloth would probably work really well too. I haven't tried that, but I think a cloth rag would be fine.
I think I have an Aurora Borealis.
Usually, I do a lot of watercolor. Wet into wet isn't something that I do super often because I'm cheap and I buy cheap paper, so it wrinkles. But I really love the beautiful, just different effects that you can get with it that are, Rachel, like you said, sometimes not what you intended. Sometimes it turns out in a good way like that. Other times can be a bit disappointing, but as the painting dries, it takes on a whole new look too. So a lot of times it seems like when I do a wet into wet, when it starts out, I say like, oh, that's terrible. But then as it dries, I kind of start to like it again. And when these do dry, if you notice an area in your sky, like for my example that I did, I think I maybe actually want more dark blue down here underneath by my trees. So when this dries, I could go back in, I could dip my brush in water, dip it into the color that I want, or I could mix two colors together up in my tray and then use that color. And I could paint wet paint onto dry paper. So you wouldn't want to do, like you wouldn't want to re-wet this sky again and do the wet into wet over the top of an already completed wet into wet. This paper just wouldn't hold up for that. All of your colors would mix and run. If you have really expensive watercolor paper, you can do that a whole bunch of times and the colors stay set on the paper. But for something like this, you would probably want to just dip your brush in water, paint, and paint onto the paper that's dried already.
Is the quality about the poundage?
Yep, poundage. Yeah, I think that's the main factor. And then you can get like hot press or cold press watercolor paper, and they're going to both behave just a little bit differently. It's mainly a difference in textures.
So
but yeah, the poundage is the big thing.
And this says perfect for all wet techniques, 140 pounds. What is that?
Can you hold up the front of it? Uh-oh, everything froze. There we go. I'm gonna make you big for a second. Yeah, I would say, I mean, I think what we are using here is 80-pound paper. So you've got something that's about twice as thick as what we have. So that would definitely be more more apt to, it's like it's not going to wrinkle as badly, and you probably can do some, you know, rewetting and the colors still won't run. I think
100 years ago, I thought I was going to do this a lot.
Yeah. Have you done a lot of watercolor in the past?
Not for 20 years.
Cool. Well, welcome back.
Thanks. I always work like always, like the few times I tried, I was obsessed with doing super small. So
Yeah.
using a full sheet of paper, that's like,
You know, I actually feel that because I'm working on 9 by 12 size paper right now, and that's about as big as I like to get with watercolor. Anything bigger, I usually switch over to acrylic or even oil. I've never been great at working large with watercolor, but I do like doing the smaller. I do a lot of sketchbook watercolor now, so like 6 by 6 inch.
That's why I could get
You can use this big brush I have next time.
Are you guys ready to go into the ground, do you think? Or should I give you a couple more minutes to do what you're doing now?
I got my
We can
sky
go to
done.
ground.
Okay. Ground is pretty simple. Once again, though, you do want to make sure the sky has dried, and I still have a little bit of wetness here, but I guess if it runs up into the sky, this will be the one that shows you what not to do. So I'm just going to go for it. So when I had done my ground in my pieces earlier, there were a few different ways that I did it. Sometimes I will have a crayon. Let's see if I can find my green crayon, or whatever color you want. And I'll do just a little bit of light coloring in my grass. Oh, here, let me put my screen back up. I'll lift this up so you can see what I'm doing, but I'm just very, very lightly coloring. So you can almost barely even see those lines, but it's just adding just a little tiny bit of texture on that page. You do not have to do this today. So I just wanted to show you that it's something that you can do if you want to. But the way that I would recommend doing the ground today would be doing more of a, it's kind of a combination between wet into wet and wet onto dry. So my paint should still be pretty wet from all of that, but I'm still gonna dip my brush in the water every time before I touch paint. I'm going to use a combination of green and brown today, maybe also a little bit of yellow in there. If you're making grass, probably thinking grass is green, and it is, but we can have variations of green by adding other colors in there. So start with a really wet brush, really wet puddle of green, and painting the green onto the dry paper. So it's actually creating a bit of a dry brush technique here and there. If you really like that effect, you could do that entirely and not change it. But what I was doing was getting my paper really wet with green and then getting it some really wet brown, which kind of looks the same as the black, but it's right beside the black. And then going in and just mixing these together. And sometimes you're going to be painting just with straight water from the water cup, especially if your paints start to feel really thick and gooey. Watercolors are meant to be thin and transparent. So if your paint looks really thick and goopy, you need to add some more water to that. But really, it's just now a process of mixing colors together until I get something that I like. Once again, I'm not going to do a ton of brushing this together because I want variations, like where this green is dark and then it's light down there and then there's some brown. I like that. I don't want it to all look one color. I think I'm going to just leave this for right now, move on to another section. If you want to be really technically accurate, your dark color would probably go down here towards the bottom of the hill, and lighter would be more towards the top of the hill. You can't tell, but I'm actually working upside down right now, so.
Oh. Wow.
My document camera is positioned on the wrong side of me, apparently, from where it naturally would be, so I've been doing lessons upside down for a few days.
And that's all being done on dry paper?
Yep, this is all dry paper right now. You can do wet into wet with your grass if you want to. For some reason, I've always just liked doing my ground a little bit more dry, or at least starting with dry paper. Some people really like to do dry brushing techniques for their grass, and that works pretty well too. But since we're working with wet into wet tonight, I decided to just keep everything wet into wet and do that effect instead. It's okay to leave some white space showing too on your paper. So I have some white lines in between my hills. I'm not even really going to worry about those. I kind of like that look. Some watercolorists will not draw with pencil or Sharpie, but instead they'll just leave white edges in between everything. So that's kind of a technique that that you may see other watercolor artists using.
Can you talk more about the crayon and what so you used a green crayon. Is that just because you were going to use green paint?
Yes.
If you'd used another color, would it have shown up? Or is it just applying the wax and it doesn't especially matter? What's up with all that?
Yeah, great questions. So I used green, yes, because I was going to have green hills. And I went so lightly that you're not going to see very much of the traditional wax resist. For the most part, the paint is going to cover up what I did because I colored so very lightly. In this first example that I showed you, I had used my green crayon to outline my hills, and then I pressed down dark. So where the paint did cover this, you still see the crayon as a wax resist. And then in this other example, this is what I was going to do in my next one. I used crayon to make the moon. So that one was a total wax resist. I colored really, really hard, and you can see there's only just a couple little places where when the paint covered over it that it actually fell down into the paper. But otherwise that completely, oops, there it is, that completely resisted from the wax. It's just kind of a texture thing, and yeah, I mean, if you want something to stay white, crayon is a good way to go. You could also go back over and highlight with white acrylic paint. That's another way to bring white back into your picture. Was there more to that question?
Color would not, the color under the paint is not necessarily going to show through as that color.
It all depends on how hard you press down when you draw with it.
Okay.
Yeah, so if you press down really lightly, it's not going to show up as much. And if you used like yellow and you painted over it with brown, if you press down very lightly, you're probably not going to see any of the yellow. If you use white and press down really hard and then paint over it with black, you're probably going to see more of that resist because you press down pretty hard. Oil pastel works the same way, and it's a lot brighter color too. So if you really want to see those whatever lines you draw with your crayon, you might actually try it in oil pastel instead, and then it's going to show up a lot stronger through the paint. I see just a little puddle over here on my side that's drying. I'm going to very carefully try to soak up that puddle. I still want my color there, so I don't want to remove too much paint. Most of this painting has dried already. It's just in the areas where my paper curled that water is setting. So I'm going to move this one aside so it can dry somewhere else. And then we'll do one more together that I can show you just a couple of those other techniques. Is everybody at a place where I can start another one, or do you want just a few more minutes to finish this one?
You can start one, I think. I'm at a place.
Okay. I don't want to leave anybody out in the cold. All right, this one, I think I'm gonna wait to do my trees, even though it probably won't dry in time tonight for me to paint over them using watercolor paint. We'll just see how it looks without any subject matter. Still thinking about our big sky. So if I wanted to do a moon with my crayon, I would do that before I start watercolor painting. Sometimes it can be hard to see when you draw white on white paper. So if you want to make your outline of your moon in pencil first and then color it in, draw very lightly with that pencil. But when I color with this crayon now, I'm coloring like as hard as I can. And I'm coloring over the same area a lot because I really don't want to see any white paper showing underneath the crayon. I want that to be a complete resist. Rubber cement works good for this too, as a watercolor resist. So if you have rubber cement around, for some reason I don't, but you can try masking out areas with rubber cement too, and then that just peels off. You just kind of rub it with your finger and it will come off after the painting is dried. So I got my moon up in my sky. You could also use crayon for drawing little snowflakes in your sky if you wanted to. I'm going to actually show you that with white acrylic paint, so I'm not going to do that. But so now, once again, use my brush to just cover this sky like crazy. I actually have a larger brush here, so I'm going to switch over to that one because it goes so much more faster. But I still want to make sure I have a ton of paint in my sky. At this point, my paint pans are really pretty wet already, so I don't need to go in and add any more drips of water to those. But I still probably will be dipping my brush in water most times before I touch it into the paint tray. I'm trying to keep so I don't get any water down in my ground yet.
We don't have any crayon. If you want to try, you can use your white colored pencil. Or a moon, if that's what you want to do.
All right, sky's wet. Let's see. I think I'm gonna try making a really, really dark night sky this time.
Just try. I want to try another.
The black in these paint trays is actually a pretty good black for it being a school grade set. It really spreads out nice.
Want a new piece of paper?
Oh, no, it just dripped.
Okay, I'm sorry. I picked mine up for you. Here, do you use your paper towel? You can blot it out, and it'll give you some texture too.
So just thinking ahead tonight, when you are completely done painting and it's time to clean up, it's a good idea to leave your paint trays open for a couple hours and let them dry out completely before you close that lid. And then when you move them around, keep them flat so the colors don't all run together. And if you have a bunch of extra wet water that spilled over into the edge of your tray, it's a good idea to either dab that out with a paper towel. I'm not a big fan of walking over and tipping it into the sink because then your colors tend to run together. So I can paint right over the top of this moon that I put up in the sky.
Well, if we had a crayon, the watercolor doesn't get in there.
Okay, that's a brush.
You could try dabbing the moon with your paper towel too. If you know exactly where you want it up in your sky, just use your paper towel and go dab, dab, dab right away.
I don't suppose a colored pencil would work.
I don't know.
Probably not. You can try it though. I'm kind of curious.
I'm curious too. I've never tried.
I say try it. Colored pencil works pretty well over watercolor once it's dried.
Okay, so maybe I'll do it that way then.
Maybe try that, yeah. Although I'm not sure about white necessarily. That I know like greens and stuff work pretty well for adding like green blades of grass.
I could do a blood red moon.
Try to puddle up some of that that's together. So got one more thing I can show you here that while your painting is wet, rubbing alcohol, basic rubbing alcohol can also create different textures. I don't know that it really like looks like snowflakes or, you know, the other stuff that we've done kind of looked like clouds, looks like a moon, looks like snowflakes. This is just sort of a cool thing you can do. So I don't know that you would necessarily do it in your sky, but I just want to show you. If you drop drips of rubbing alcohol it's going to make your watercolor say no and go away from these drips. Let me move it closer so you can see. Okay, so here's my painting. Drips of rubbing alcohol. Oh, it doesn't show you very well in the screen.
It shows, you can see it.
Okay.
What do you
And
say?
I just kind of like random textures. So even though this maybe doesn't have anything to do with the sky that I'm making, I just kind of like that effect that it gives. So wanted to show it to you. So I'm gonna let this one dry again before I do anything with the ground, but you can see how my moon is a little bit of color snuck in there, but for the most part, that crayon resisted just fine. So I can slide this out of the way. The last technique that I really wanted to show you is using white acrylic paint to create snowflakes. And that's something that you would want to wait to do until your picture has dried. So I'll use this one from earlier for that because that one is totally dried. The white acrylic that I have is this kind. It's a little bit thicker paint. It's for painting, you know, paintings on canvases. You can get those smaller bottles that are like 50 cents at Walmart, the acrylic craft paint. And that actually works a little bit better for this because it's thinner, it's a little bit runnier. So this paint that's kind of thick, I'm gonna have to mix it with just a little bit of water to thin it down because we want it to be able to splatter. And the thickness that it's at right now, it would splatter, but it would leave like big lines and globs. And I just want little tiny dots. So I'm gonna just put some, got this paint tray. I don't need very much at all. So just a tiny little squirt in there. I need to work in a place where this light isn't so bright. So then I wanna take just a tiny bit of water and drop it in that paint. And I'm gonna mix that up. Then there's a few ways that you can do this. Actually, if you have a toothbrush, an old toothbrush that you're not using, you can use that to splatter. I usually just take my brush and kind of tap it like this on my finger. And it's gonna leave white spots in the sky. You could also use your finger to actually flick the brush like this. That's gonna make smaller snowflakes. If you do this when your painting is still wet, since acrylic paint is a water-based paint, the paint will kind of spread out and, you know, melt in with your watercolor. So that's why you want to save this till it's totally dried.
I don't know, my kid's watching TV, right?
I guess it's the first snow of the year in this one since I have grass. How are you guys doing?
Good. I just don't know how you get so much paint on the paper so fast.
Like 30 years of practice, pretty much. No, it's, you know, you get faster as you go because I think a lot of factors, like number one, you know, you get used to the process and you get more confident and then it's easier to go faster. But then you also just kind of get used to the idea that, wow, this paper is going to dry quickly and I just need to move. It also takes a little while to get used to paint consistencies and to just kind of know like when you need more water, when your paint is thick enough. Those are just things that come with time and practice. If anybody wants to try to show me their painting, though, I would totally love to see them.
I decided to paint my trees in, so I'm working on that right now.
Okay.
I think if I lifted it up to show you, it would all run off the page.
It definitely would, yes. So don't do that. So if you can't finagle your computer screen in a way to show me, then probably wait till it's dry.
I'm feeling like I've never done this before. It's not going the way I hoped.
No, what's happening?
Oh, it just turns into, I don't know, when you put your paint into the water, it seems to still have a hard edge. Mine seems to just look like a pool of water. Maybe I'm not putting enough pigment into it.
That could be. And that really is tricky for me to, because it seems like I tend to want to water everything down too much. With these, I did a pretty good job of like letting that pigment be strong, but I think initially when you put it down and it's so strong, you're like, oh no, I don't want that. But then when it starts to dry, it fades out. And
Yeah,
yeah.
that's exactly what's happening to me.
Yeah, so if you do another one, don't be afraid to go bold with it. And the only other thing, without looking at it, the only other thing I would say is just make sure that you're not moving your paints together too much, that when you're dropping them down, they're just kind of staying there and you're not trying to mix together. But right, if your paint is, if it's all puddling kind of to the center, there's not much you can do other than try to dab up some of that water and let it remix itself.
I'm gonna try this. All right, Linda, here it comes.
Okay.
I think.
Bigger.
No, there's.
Close.
I totally have my laptop upside down.
That's awesome. Yeah, let me see here. I think your top and your side where the salt is, I think that's gonna dry really awesome. I think you probably could put more pigment in the center if it's still wet there. I can't really tell.
Can I re-wet it?
I wouldn't re-wet it.
Okay.
You can try it.
Or I could try again.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, if you want to just make this one where you experiment and try re-wetting it, but my fear is that re-wetting it is gonna make everything that you have just kind of all mixed together and become like brownish color, and then anything that you would put on top of it would mix in with that too. Okay. Usually re-wetting something that's already been wet into wet, unless you're working on like really high heavy paper, usually it just kind of turns into like a muddy mess. So
okay.
Yeah, but
I'll use it as experimenting.
If you want to do that, and then let me know if I was wrong about what I just said.
Oh, I'm sure not.
I'm actually using a couple different kinds of paper up here. One of them was one that we have from class, but then the others were just like some random watercolor paper I had. So
I used to have watercolor paper, but I donated it to the art center.
I probably used it long ago. So here was the first one that we did together. And I'm really, really happy with how that one's turning out, actually.
It looks really nice.
Thank you. Might have to do more wet into wet stuff. But you can really see the salt pattern now.
Oh, yeah.
And this one is the wet one, so the salt is still up there. So, it didn't take very long for it to just kind of eat away at the pigment. So that's why they say make sure you brush it off, or eventually it will, I guess it just continues to eat away at the pigment the longer it sits on the paper. Arnie and Rachel, how are you doing?
I'm really happy with this sky. I was not happy with my daytime sky, but I'm pretty happy with this night sky. I'll see if I can show you.
Oh, good. Yay. Yeah. Yeah, that's pretty. Good job.
That was my other sky, which I'm not thrilled with.
It's not bad though. It probably just maybe is a little bit more color next time, a little more pigment in there.
Yeah, maybe I'm too happy with the water. My paper was drying so fast, I think I thought I could compensate for it with wet paint, but that might not be true.
Yeah. I mean, to some extent you can, but right, when you're doing wet into wet, that paper really needs to be the thing that's, you know, allowing the paint to pool. Because even when you try to just add like drips of just plain water on top, it seems like the paint has already kind of stuck down to the paper and it doesn't want to expand the way that it does when it's really wet paper. Arnie, how's yours going?
Oh, it's okay.
Yeah, let me see here. Ooh, I love it. Wow. That's awesome.
I used, I got these very awesome metallic paints off of Etsy. This woman makes the stuff, and I had sort of a bronzy silver that I used to make the moon. So I like the moon because the moon just shines.
Yeah. Oh, I think that's a really great composition. Did you do your trees with Sharpie, or did you paint them in later?
I painted them.
Okay. I kind of thought maybe you had done that. Sometimes it's a little hard to tell on the screen, but looks.
One turned out really good, and the rest are like mediocre.
The problem with doing multiples of anything.
Yes,
Looks like you might have masking taped your paper down.
I did.
Nice. It just gives it such a professional look when you do that. You know, it's almost like it's in its own frame already. So
Now, one of the things that I kind of follow a couple of watercolor Facebook pages, and one of the things I learned a while back that someone mentioned was that if your paper was kind of buckled and you know, reacting to the water it had been under, and you wanted to get it flat again, after it's completely dry, you can spritz water on the back of it.
yep.
Then put books on top or something heavy on top to flatten it, and then let it dry that way.
Yes.
Have you ever tried that?
Yes. Yes.
Does that work?
Well, honestly, I hardly ever do the spritzing first. A lot of times I just put something flat under the book and then it tends to, you know, kind of fix itself anyway. But I have done that. I know that's how I was taught to do it back in college. And yeah, it works. It might not work perfectly. You know, you might still have a little bit of a crinkle in there, but it's definitely gonna help things out quite a bit.
Okay.
Yeah, because like this first painting that I did, the way that this one is curling, here, let me put it back on me. Whoops. I don't know how well you guys can see it or not, but it's more curling just like a bend. It's not really wrinkly all over. So for this one, I probably could lay it just under something flat overnight and it would flatten itself out again. This other one that I have here that's drying right now, that has a lot more wavy curls. So that one might be a better candidate for the spritzing and then laying flat.
Okay.
Anybody have any questions or comments or feedback or anything?
Fun way to spend a night.
What's that?
I said it's been fun way to spend the evening.
Oh, good. Yes, I've had fun with you all as well too. So thank you for painting with me.
Yeah, I'm so glad. Like, I was doing any class I could do at the Art Center, and then there weren't any for a really long time, and then there was a pandemic. So I'm really appreciative that this is here.
Yeah. Thank you for doing this, Linda.
Yeah, no problem. Like I said, I really enjoyed it. So I'm still kind of learning with the Zoom. So thank you for hanging with me as I get that all figured out, but it gets a little easier every time.
I'm definitely inspired to keep going and doing a few more.
Good.
Yes.
Yeah, I know I showed you kind of a lot of different techniques and stuff, but yeah, keep playing around with them, try them out individually, and then As you go, you'll find ways to use them, and just some of the stuff like the salt and the alcohol is just a neat way to add additional texture to your painting. And then, you know, like I showed you with the ground down here for blending a few colors together, definitely makes it more interesting to look at stuff like this than just a green grass. So have fun experimenting with it all. And let's see, let me think about, I think we covered already being careful with your paint trays when it's time to clean up. I'm just going to leave mine open all night long. One other kind of random tip that I have, if you really like doing painting and you're going to do a lot of wet into wet watercolor, you might want to get like some baking sheets or trays like that that you can just have your painting on and be working on that tray, and then you could really easily move it out to the side, put your next one down, work on that one, move it out to the side. So that's something that works pretty well too.
When you tape your sheet down, is there a trick to getting the tape on evenly? Because when I pulled my tape off of this, one edge was crooked, so it shows that it's crooked.
Sure.
Is there a trick?
Yeah. I mean, you could measure, you know, you could like
Oh yeah, okay.
draw a line along the edge, ½ inch in on either side, or if you even had like a whatever you're taping it to, if that was gridded so that you could match up your tape lines that way, that would probably help too.
Can you hand me that paper?
No.
How rude. Yes, I made a mess.
Watercolor's just a little messy.
Well, I did know that in advance, and Michael cut these 2 plywood boards down so we had a work surface.
Oh, sweet. Well, the good thing about watercolor though is that it's washable. So there's a few colors that will stain. I don't know that any in this pack that we're working with right now will, but I know like if you buy the 2 watercolors, there's a couple of reds and some blues that sometimes, like if you get them on your clothes or on your table, liquid watercolor too. If anybody's ever worked with liquid watercolor, holy cow, that stuff stains right away. So
Really?
Really, yeah. The blue especially, like it's bad. Like you spill it, and if you don't clean it up that second, it's there. Magic erasers, though, I found work pretty well for cleaning up, you know, the stubborn watercolor that doesn't want to come up with just water. But for the most part, like what we use tonight, a soapy rag should be able to wipe up any mess that you have.
And you said once they're completely dry, we can go back in with dry brush or whatever and do our
Yep. Yep. Once they're totally dry, and sometimes it's kind of deceiving, you know, like they look dry. So, but if you feel it, you kind of feel that they're a little bit damp, or, you know, like if they're still cool to the touch, I think then they're usually still a little bit damp. So probably these, if it were me, even though it's hard to let something dry overnight and then come back to it, I would probably be inclined to just let it dry overnight and then work on it again in the morning. And you'll notice the weather plays a factor too. Like if it's really humid out, your painting will dry very slowly. Tonight when I started this, I had my window open a little bit, and I thought I better close that because that breeze is gonna make my painting dry really fast. So the weather does affect how watercolor works a little bit too.
Good to know.
Yeah. All right, does anybody have anything else, or should we wrap up for the night?
I'm good. Thank you very much.
Good. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you again so much for spending your Friday with me, and hope to see you all again for another class sometime soon.
Great
Awesome.
happy hour.
Yeah. All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
All right, thank you, Linda. Can you, Linda, if you just end that recording and then maybe forward me the link, or if you want to forward it
Yeah.
directly to Jolene.
Yeah, we'll get it figured out. Okay.